Hello everyone, and welcome to my Young and the Restless official 24 channel. In the nothingness of night, with Genoa City wrapped in a suffocating hush that felt nearly conspiratorial, Cain Ashby and Phyllis Summers stood outside Victor Newman's inner sanctum knowing that formerly they crossed this line there would be no going back, because this wasn't just another commercial sabotage or petty vengeance scheme. This was a descent straight into the heart of Newman power where secrets were buried deep and defended by fear, plutocrat, and blood, and as Cain bypassed the final subcast of security with hands that slightly quivered, Phyllis watched the door like a bloodsucker seeing the moment before the kill, her palpitation pounding not with mistrustfulness but with expectation, because she knew, she felt it in her bones, that Victor Newman had been hiding commodity so explosive it could eventually bring the great Victor to his knees. And when the laptop eventually flitted to life in the dim gleam of the office beacon, the screen illuminating their faces like a concession cell, neither of them was prepared for the words that goggled back at them in stark, merciless textbook "Kill Victor now," a train name so blunt, so nipping, that for a split second indeed Phyllis Summers lost her breath, because this wasn't tropical, it wasn't some dramatic flourish or enciphered commercial initiative, it was a directive, a plan. A command that suggested Victor Newman himself was the target, or worse, the mastermind of commodity far darker than anyone had ever imagined, and as Cain began digging deeper, scrolling through translated flyers and hidden partitions, the weight of what they were uncovering pressed down on them like a physical force, revealing a maze of surveillance logs, coastal accounts, burner phone reiterations, and contingency plans labeled with dates, names, and issues that read like a death tally. And suddenly it came horrifyingly clear that Victor had been preparing for war on multiple fronts, not just against business rivals but against his own family, his adversaries, and anyone who dared to challenge his control. And when Phyllis leaned in and refocused at a time-stamped communication representing an offered medical exigency and a private security contractor known for making people vanish, Cain felt the room spin because the recrimination was inarguable. Victor Newman had considered orchestrating his own death or someone differently's, manipulating the fate to flush out serpents, seize absolute control, or frame an adversary, and in that moment Cain realized this wasn't just about taking Victor down presently, it was about survival, because if Victor suspected indeed a tale of treason, the fallout would be disastrous. And yet Phyllis, ever intrepid, ever addicted to the rush of standing at the edge of destruction, smiled with a dangerous glint in her eye as she rumored that this was it, this was the evidence they'd been hunting, the nuclear option that could eventually end Victor's reign of terror. And as they continued to crack the laptop, subcast by subcast, the plot only thickened, revealing dispatches that tied Victor to covert operations designed to destabilize rival companies, blackmail public officers, and manipulate law enforcement issues, all while maintaining his untouchable public image as the ruthless but respectable Goliath of assiduity. And also came the lines marked with familiar names: Jack Abbott, Adam Newman, Victoria Newman, Nick Newman, each brochure containing cerebral biographies, influence points, and neutralization strategies that made Cain's stomach churn, because this wasn't just paranoia, this was premeditated control. A chessboard where Victor had formerly planned the wind-up for everyone. And when Phyllis uncovered a videotape train recorded just days before, Victor's voice filled the room, calm, cold, and chillingly confident as he spoke about ending the chaos formerly and for all, and icing that no bone lives long enough to betray me again. And in that moment, the verity formed into commodity inarguable and intimidating. Victor Newman believed himself justified in destroying anyone who hovered his conglomerate, indeed if it meant blood on his hands. And as Cain slammed the laptop shut for a moment, pacing the room like a boxed beast, he realized that exposing this could enkindle a war that would tear Genoa City piecemeal, but keeping it secret would make them complicit in whatever Victor was planning next. And Phyllis, seeing his vacillation, reminded him of every life Victor had formerly ruined, every family shattered, every adversary crushed under his heel, averring that this was justice, not treason. And when they eventually copied the lines onto multiple translated drives, icing the substantiation could no way be completely cancelled, the graveness of their theft settled in like a death judgment, because they hadn't just stolen information, they had stolen Victor Newman's eternity. And as admonition suddenly chimed vocally in the distance, motioning a delayed security reach, Cain and Phyllis changed a look that said everything: fear, exhilaration, and the implied knowledge that they were now adversaries of the most important man in Genoa City, and as they slipped out into the night, the words, "Kill Victor," now echoed in their minds not as an instruction, but as a vaticination, because whether Victor intended to fake his death, orchestrate someone additional's, or exclude a perceived trouble, the verity was out there now, dangerous and unpredictable, and once the secret surfaced, nothing would ever be the same again, alliances would deteriorate, families would fracture, and the myth of Victor Newman as an untouchable force of nature would eventually be exposed as what it truly was, a man so consumed by power and paranoia that he'd finagled his own implicit downfall, and as Cain and Phyllis faded into the murk, clinging evidence that could destroy Victor ever, one thing was certain: this wasn't the end of the story. It was the morning of a reckoning that would shake Genoa City to its core and leave no bone unscathed. As the night swallowed Cain Ashby and Phyllis Summers whole, the weight of what they had stolen pressed heavier with every step they took down from the Newman emulsion. Because evidence like that didn't just sit still on a flash drive, it palpitated, it breathed, it demanded consequences, and by the time they reached the auto situated 3 blocks down, both of them knew that Victor Newman would feel this theft before he ever discovered it, the way a bloodsucker senses a shift in the air when the balance of power tilts ever so slightly against him, and as Phyllis slid into the passenger seat, clinging the translated drives like a lifeline, her mind contended through every script, every possible move Victor might make. Formerly he realized his most guarded secrets were no longer under his control, because Victor Newman didn't reply, he redressed, and retribution was always surgical, always ruinous, and Cain, gripping the steering wheel as if it were the only thing tethering him to reality, couldn't shake the image of those flyers labeled with names he knew too well, because this wasn't abstract presently, this wasn't just commercial spying or moral outrage, this was particular, sorrowfully particular, and as they drove through the quiet thoroughfares of Genoa City, Phyllis eventually broke the silence, her voice low but electric as she laid out the verity Cain was trying to overrun. Formerly they exposed this, there would be no caching place, no neutral ground, no bone untouched by the fallout, because Victor had erected his conglomerate on fear and influence, and now they held the master key to dismembering it, piece by piece, and Cain knew she was right, yet the fear eroded at him anyway, because Victor wasn't just important, he was regular, and the idea that they had seen only a bit of his contingency plans made Cain wonder how numerous way ahead Victor formerly was, indeed now, indeed ignorant of the breach. And when they reached Phyllis's safe house, a modest, citable place chosen precisely because Victor would no way anticipate her to hide commodity so explosive in plain sight, they wasted no time getting to work, laptops humming, encryption software handling, backup clones being uploaded to coastal waiters and dead drop locales that Phyllis had prepared long ahead tonight, because Phyllis Summers no way jumped without a net, indeed when the jump itself looked like madness, and as Cain watched her move with sharp perfection, he realized this was the Phyllis he both respected and stressed, the woman who thrived in chaos, who could gawk into the ocean and dare it to blink first, and as the lines deciphered further, revealing indeed more nipping details, the compass of Victor's plot expanded beyond anything they'd originally imagined, exposing not just plans but timelines, not just pitfalls but practices, including dissembled scripts where Victor's junking would spark request defeats, hostile appropriations, and a power vacuum that he alone had counterplotted out how to control from beyond the grave, and suddenly the question wasn't whether Victor intended to die or kill, it was whether he intended to rule indeed after death, and when Cain uncovered a retired subfolder detailing a heritage protocol, complete with instructions to pious operatives to execute a prearranged conduct the moment certain conditions were met, he felt sick, because this wasn't despair, this was preoccupation. A man so addicted to control that he'd designed a future where free will itself was voluntary, and Phyllis, reading over his shoulder, let out a sharp laugh devoid of humor, pointing out that Victor hadn't just planned for treason, he'd monetized it, weaponized it, turned it into a system that awarded obedience and penalized dissent with surgical atrocity, and as dawn crept closer, the enormity of what they held came inarguable, because this substantiation didn't just interlace Victor in implicit crimes, it exposed a gospel, a worldview where morality was inapplicable and power was the only verity, and when the sun eventually rose, casting pale light across the room, Cain realized they had crossed into home where right and wrong no longer offered protection, only consequences, and as if summoned by the sheer audacity of their discovery, Victor Newman himself sat long hauls down in his study, gaping at his laptop with a moue he couldn't relatively explain, because commodity felt off. Commodity subtle yet unmistakable, like a cinch that no longer turned easily, and though no alarm had sounded, no alert had been touched off, Victor knew, he always knew, that someone had touched what wasn't theirs, and as he sluggishly closed the screen, his expression darkened with commodity far more dangerous than wrathfulness resoluteness, because if someone had seen those lines, also the time for contingency had arrived, and while Kane and Phyllis batted their coming move, whether to go to Jack, to the authorities, or straight to the press, they failed to realize that Victor had formally begun executing phase 1 of damage control, still summoning trusted abettors, rerouting finances, and cranking surveillance protocols designed to bomb out serpents before they could strike, and by the time Phyllis suggested oohing a portion of the lines as a test balloon to gauge response, Victor had formally ordered background reaches on everyone who'd been within a far of his office that night, and when Kane's name appeared on the list, Victor's lips twisted into a thin, knowing smile, because treason always came from those who believed themselves righteous, and as the net tensed, Kane and Phyllis set up themselves contending against a timepiece they hadn't known was, every hour adding the threat that Victor would strike first, and when Phyllis eventually made the call to an anonymous contact with ties to civil investigators, her voice steady despite the stakes, she set into stir a chain response that would soon ripple through Genoa City, because once the first domino fell, there would be no stopping the collapse, and as whispers began circulating rumors of a secret train, of Victor Newman's conglomerate erected on commodity darker than ambition, the walls began to crack, abettors grew nervous, adversaries grew bold, and Victor, seeing the shift, as the pressure mounted and the megacity sounded to hum with an turnabout of impending disaster, Kane Ashby felt the walls closing in faster than he'd anticipated. Because every shadow outside the window now looked like a watcher, every passing temptress sounded like a warning, and every vibration of Phyllis's phone felt like the possible warning of the end, yet despite the fear clawing at his casket, there was no turning back, not after what they had seen, not after understanding that Victor Newman's power wasn't just directed on intimidation and wealth but on a strictly finagled armature of manipulation that extended far beyond the boardroom. And as Phyllis eventually entered evidence that the first batch of lines had reached civil hands, translated, anonymized, and insolvable to trace back to them without extraordinary trouble, a grim sense of ineluctability settled over the room, because now the machine had been set in stir, and machines like this didn't stop, they only escalated, and indeed as Phyllis allowed herself a detail, razor-thin smile of satisfaction, she knew Victor would formerly be fighting, formerly rewriting narratives, formerly planting seeds of mistrustfulness wherever he could, because Victor Newman didn't stay to be indicted, he preemptively discredited, and sure enough, within hours, whispers began circulating through Genoa City's nobility circles, subtle at first, also louder, rumors that Kane Ashby had been acting aimlessly, that Phyllis Summers was twisting again, that the two of them were conniving commodity reckless fueled by resentment and ambition, and Kane watched in real time as Victor's playbook unfolded with intimidating effectiveness, because suddenly old abettors were distant, friendly calls went unanswered, and indeed Jack Abbott, a man who had his own long history with Victor, dithered when Kane reached out, seeing the unnoticeable hand steering him down from the Verity, and it was in that moment that Kane truly understood the depth of Victor's control not through brute force, but through narrative dominance, because Victor didn't just crush his adversaries, he rewrote who they were before anyone could hear their side, and as Phyllis tracked online chatter and fiscal movements, she discovered commodity indeed more intimidating. Victor had begun executing corridor of the legacy protocol beforehand, transferring means, cranking shell companies, and driving clauses that would isolate Newman Enterprises from disastrous fallout, effectively daring anyone to try to take him down, because indeed if he fell, he intended to drag the entire megacity into chaos with him, and when Kane brazened Phyllis about the threat, about how numerous innocent people could be contributory damage in this war, Phyllis snapped back with a raw honesty that cut deeper than any blameworthiness, reminding him that Victor had no way watched about angels, that every conglomerate he erected was formerly soaked in blood tropical or else, and that stopping him now, indeed at great cost, was the only way to help commodity far worse, And as the hours blurred into a tense surveillance, advance came from an unanticipated direction when one of the lines flagged by the investigators revealed a preliminarily overlooked audio recording, a private discussion between Victor and an unnamed associate agitating junking options with nipping indifference. And as Kane heeded to Victor's unmistakable voice calmly importing the pros and cons of barring a trouble permanently, any moping mistrustfulness he'd faded. Because this was end proposition presently, it was intent. And as Phyllis prepared to blunder this specific recording to a trusted intelligencer known for exposing commercial crimes, she dithered just long enough to admit the graveness of what she was about to do, because formerly Victor's voice was out there. Once the world heard him speak those words, there would be no presumptive deniability left, and when the story eventually broke, precisely framed, strictly sourced, and devastating in its counter-accusations, the effect was immediate and explosive. Because requests quivered, stock prices dipped, and the formerly unquestioned air of Victor Newman cracked just enough for the public to regard the darkness beneath. And while Victor intimately dismissed the allegations as fabricated falsehoods orchestrated by bitter adversaries, intimately he unleashed a fury that shook indeed his most pious operatives, ordering internal examinations, tensing security, and preparing legal and extra-legal responses that would neutralize the trouble at its source. And Kane felt the shift incontinently, because suddenly he wasn't just being ignored, he was being hunted, followed by unmarked buses, questioned by familiarity who suddenly sounded rehearsed, and when Phyllis hardly avoided a battle with a private security platoon outside one of her known parcels, the communication was clear. Victor knew it was them, and he was closing in, and as they regrouped at a secondary position, prostration etched into their faces. Kane raised the fear they had both been avoiding, that Victor might not stop at intimidation, that if he felt truly cornered, he'd escalate to commodity unrecoverable, and Phyllis, for formerly stripped of her usual bravado, admitted that this was the most dangerous game she had ever played, because Victor wasn't just fighting to survive, he was fighting to maintain the myth of his invincibility, and men like that didn't surrender still. And when news broke that civil investigators were officially opening a primary inquiry into Newman Enterprises, the megacity inclusively held its breath, because this was unknown home, yet indeed also, Victor managed to turn the narrative, painting himself as a victim of a coordinated smear crusade while still obliging politicians and controllers behind unrestricted doors. And as Kane watched interviews where Victor spoke with righteous outrage, he realized how fluently verity could be drowned out by confidence and power, and it scarified him, because it meant that indeed with substantiation, indeed with instigation, palm was far from guaranteed, and when an anonymous communication arrived on Phyllis's secure line, 3 words only, "I know everything," the room went silent, because there was no mistaking the recrimination, no mistaking the hand imminence behind it, and Kane felt a cold certainty settle over him that Victor was done playing defense, that the preamble inferred by "kill Victor now" was nearing its final moments, and as they batted whether to go completely public, to release everything at formerly in a scorched earth move that would leave no room for spin or repression, the cost came sorrowfully clear, because doing so would not just destroy Victor, it would destabilize families, livelihoods, and an entire megacity erected around Newman influence, and yet holding back meant giving Victor time he'd used to abolish them fully. And as dawn approached formerly more, mirroring the night this all began, Kane stood at the crossroads of morality and survival, understanding that history infrequently flashed back those who dithered, only those who acted, and as Phyllis prepared the final day to drop, her hands steady despite the chaos around them, she looked at Kane with an admixture of resoluteness and vulnerability, admitting that whatever happened next would define them ever, not as villains or icons, but as the bones who dared to pull back the curtain on Victor Newman's conglomerate of fear. And as the lines began uploading to multiple outlets contemporaneously, an unrecoverable act of exposure, Kane felt a strange calm marshland over him, because the choice had been made, the line crossed, and whatever blood was revealed coming, tropological or else, would be on Victor's hands, not theirs. And as Genoa City braced for impact, ignorant of how deeply the ground beneath it was about to crack, one verity echoed louder than any scuttlebutt or denial. Victor Newman's reign was no longer unchallenged, and whether he fell through reproach, execution, or a far darker fate, the secret stolen from that laptop had formerly assured that the myth of Victor Newman would no way survive complete again. Kane and Phyllis didn't realize they were formerly two-way before, because Victor had shifted the battleground from exposure to narrative, planting seeds of mistrustfulness about the authenticity of the leaks, framing them as a hopeless fabrication by bitter rivals. And when whispers began circulating that the lines might be doctored, that Kane Ashby had commodity to gain from destabilizing Newman Enterprises, Kane felt the mesh strain, because verity alone was no way enough in Victor's world. Perception was everything, and Victor controlled perception like an armament, and as the pressure mounted, Kane set up himself visited by the possibility that indeed if they released everything, indeed if the world saw the verity, Victor might still survive it, because men like Victor didn't fall fluently, they acclimated, they exfoliate skin, they offered pawns, and Phyllis, watching Kane unravel, eventually admitted what she hadn't said audibly before, that there was a final train they hadn't released, the most dangerous one, the one labeled not with strategy or contingency but with a single nipping expression repeated across multiple drafts, termination window, a plan outlining a narrow timeframe in which Victor believed he could be excluded or exclude someone differently with minimum fallout, and as Kane read through it, his blood ran cold, because bedded within the plan were dates that were uncomfortably near, names that suggested Victor believed a decisive act was imminent, and suddenly the meaning of "kill Victor now" shifted again, no longer just